Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Over the centuries, one of the main challenges in evangelizing countries in the Far East, such as China, has been bridging the cultural gap that exists between their culture and the cultures in which revelation was communicated and the Church's tradition articulated. Moreover, those evangelizing have disagreed over how to approach this challenge, most famously during the Chinese rites controversy. Similar debates and difficulties exist today. At the same time, these efforts to evangelize have often resulted in great success and notable examples of the enculturation of the gospel. In this interview, Joshua R. Brown discusses the enculturation of the gospel in China and some of the best books on the subject. Joshua R. Brown is associate professor in the Department of Theology at Mount St. Mary's University. He is the co-author of Transcendence and Non-Naturalism in Early Chinese Thought and the author of Balthasar in Light of Early Confucianism and Aquinas and Early Chinese Masters, Chinese Philosophy in Catholic Theology. The books discussed in this episode are, first, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven by Matteo Ricci, second, Yang Tingyun, Confucian and Christian in Late Ming China, His Life and Thought by Nicholas Standard, third, Ways of Confucius and of Christ, from Prime Minister of China to Benedictine Monk by Dompierre Celestin Lu, fourth, Beyond East and West by John C.H. Wu, and fifth, Material Objects in Confucian and Aristotelian Metaphysics, The Inevitability of Hylomorphism by James Dominic Rooney. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top recommendation on the platform of your choice. Professor Joshua Brown, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the invitation.
First of all, what do you mean by Chinese Catholicism? Because you're not referring to the current social situation of the Church in China. Instead, you appear to be referring to the integration of the valid, compatible elements of classical Chinese thought and culture into the evangelization and spirituality of Chinese Catholics.
Yes. Yeah. So there is in a particular sense, right? Chinese Catholicism refers to the Catholic tradition as lived and experienced in mainland China and the Chinese diaspora, places like Taiwan, Singapore. And I'm interested in those conversations, but that's not my primary focus as a researcher and writer. What I'm more interested in, and especially my recent book that led to our conversation, is the project of Chinese Catholic theology, which part of that entails, like this in the tradition I find myself in, attempting to negotiate how Chinese cultural concepts, ideas, commitments, right, including Chinese philosophical ideas, can be used to help understand and articulate the Catholic faith. So that's, you could say, the Chinese Catholicism that I'm talking about or think about most deeply is the Catholic tradition as kind of articulated in a way that invites Chinese culture to be part of that world. Right? So that's what we mean, not necessarily the on-the-ground political, social experience of Chinese Catholics, certainly. So I appreciate the attempt to clarify that.
What are the distinctive traits of Chinese Catholicism?
Well, I mean, so in some ways, like every other tradition, it has its own distinctive problems. In terms of the problems that I worked on and think about more deeply, certainly you'd say that the concern to articulate how the philosophical you could call them even theological, religious, however description you want to use. Traditions of China have shaped the Chinese consciousness, the Chinese spirit, as it were, Chinese culture, and how that continues to be important for Chinese identity. Right? And so, for a lot of Chinese Catholics, what they want to do is embrace the fullness of the beauty of being Catholic, being the church, right? And also pay homage to and carry out the tradition of being Chinese, good Chinese, right? And so seeing how those things go together is one of the key problems, you could say, of the Chinese Catholic theological tradition. As well as other ways just of dealing with the pastoral problems that are faced by people in those areas like China, Taiwan, Singapore. Um, but for my part, the intellectual challenge of, like I said earlier, negotiating classical Chinese thought, right, with Catholic principles and doctrines is that one of the key problems.
What prompted your own interest in Chinese Catholicism?
That's a wonderful question. I was raised neither Chinese nor Catholic, as you could probably tell. So I was raised in a rural part of North Carolina, which is a state in the eastern part of the United States. Raised Southern Baptist, a very anti-Catholic Protestant denomination, and then through the vicissitudes of fate or the guide work of providence, I, in successive years, met and then married my wife, and then became Catholic myself. So my wife is Malaysian Chinese, so she's from Chinese culture and heritage, but grew up in Malaysia. And when I became Catholic, especially, we faced the challenge of starting a family, and I realized that I wasn't very knowledgeable about how to actually live out a life as a Catholic or in a Chinese family in which we celebrate Chinese holidays and we adapt some Chinese language. And I wanted to be able to pass something on of note to my children and help support them in that part of their background. So that led me to the way that I resolved it was just to work that into my doctoral studies in theology. And along the way, began to deeply read the early Confucian, early Taoist philosophy, fell in love with studying it, and then over time have just come to love more and more uh, the Chinese intellectual world, that is, especially Chinese language, as a vehicle, as a vessel for thinking about the great mysteries of God and the church, and the principles and the commitments that animate the Chinese world. So, and it could say a kind of practical necessity leading to an awareness of the great beauty of the Chinese Catholic tradition. That led me to where I am.
You recently published a comparative study of St. Thomas Aquinas and the early Chinese masters. Who are the early Chinese masters, and what resemblances are there between their thoughts and the theology of St. Thomas?
Well, okay, so I would say, first of all, just to clarify for possible readers, uh, in the book, one thing I actually am trying to do is to pose what I can call a heuristic question, or that is a question that helps us probe certain subject matter. In this case, I kind of asked the question: what would it be like if Thomas had himself read early Chinese philosophy? Right? How would he have adjudicated what he found there, and what would he have found lacking? That kind of thing, right? So that's a nice caveat. In the book that I deal with mainly 3, 4-ish masters, particularly Mengzi or Mencius, as you may know him in the Latin language, Xunzi, whose name is not Latinized, and Mozi, right, who was another school, the master of a different school in early China. You could also put a lot of other masters in there. So Confucius himself, although it's debated how much we have access to Confucius's own writings. I talk about the early Confucian master Zhuangzi in the book in a secondary kind of way. There's also early Taoist figures, Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, text, Zhuangzi, are the two main Taoist masters, um, and a host of others. So I've written on more other figures before that we could bring into it. So those are the general kind of cast of characters, you could say. But in the book specifically, Mengzi, Xunzi, Mozi are the three stars. Um, Now, to the question of what would Thomas have found there that's similar? Well, so one argument I make in the book, in the introduction, so it's not like a highly developed argument, but I do think that Aquinas would have read, if he read all the texts of early China, he probably would have, in my estimation, thought that the uh, Confucian and the Moist tradition had the most clear analogs to Catholic wisdom, right? Or Aristotelian wisdom, if you like, right? So, on the one hand, in Confucianism, there's a very clear uh, development of something like Aristotelian ethics, right? Like the notion that we are social animals, that we are relational selves, we are bound to, um, or ordered towards, should say, um, life in community that leads to our own flourishing. That we need to develop moral virtues in order to become who we are, right? That the job of being human, or actually in the Chinese is the Ren Dao, the Dao of being human, is to find our kind of role in the cosmos, and the moral virtue of the human being is how we enact that role, that place in the cosmos. According to Confucius, I think Aquinas would find a lot there. Um, Both Confucians and the Mohists also have a deep devotion, or deep space, I should say, um, for the concept of heaven, or Tian. And I have a couple chapters to talk about this in the book. Monson was more about this, I think. But so Tian is this term usually described as meaning like the high god of the Zhou dynasty, which is when a lot of the early Chinese philosophy was written. And there's not really a strong the tradition of Tian as a creator of the world, but there is a strong tradition of Tian as the governor of the world, the one who provides and who shapes the rising, falling, and who is a kind of moral deity that desires goodness and virtue, especially from rulers, right? Um, so that kind of providential wisdom that guides the cosmos, I think Aquinas would deeply appreciate that. And the last thing I'll note is I think Aquinas would have a very deep esteem for the way that Christians like Confucianism and Mohism debate the ways in which we ought to love and care for others, right? So in the Mozi, there's this debate that I have Aquinas, or try to suggest Aquinas could read, right, where he talks about the Mozi wants to argue for universal love, impartial care for other people, as kind of the solution to the world's ills. And he thinks that the particular love of family members can get in the way of that, right? And I think that Aquinas could appreciate some of that, and in light of the Christian virtue of charity, and also would critique that and become more Confucian, right? But I think he would appreciate the debate that they're having about how we care for people and how that leads to the right, where you say the imitation or participation with Tian or heaven, and the flourishing of broader society. So those are just some things. There's more I could talk about, but those are the main ones I'd say.
There may be a presence. I'm merely putting forth a hypothesis here. There will be an erosion of traditional ethics in China, just as there is secularization in the West. And going forward, appealing to early Chinese philosophy or traditional values may not be a surer bridge for evangelization in China. Perhaps the main challenge will be materialist atheism, as it is in the West. Do you think that's what's on the cards?
That is a tremendous question, right? So there's a couple ways to see that. On the one hand, there's a bishop from Taiwan, who originally from China, then was bishop in Taiwan for a long time, named Stanislas Luoguang, that I really look up to, and I love reading his theology and things. He does a really great job of on the one hand, articulating that kind of concern, right? That in mainland China, for example, you have an overwhelming of traditional ethics, traditional conceptions of the human person and moral flourishing by the atheistic materialism, and in places like Taiwan and Singapore, you have often the consumerist materialism that takes over. So the both wings of modernity, in a certain respect, do find their influence in China, and they've been profoundly impactful in shaping the societies that were heretofore, at least, shaped in the Confucian matrix, you could say. So in that regard, I certainly don't think that simply recovering uh, a conversation with traditional Chinese philosophy is the only step towards evangelization, right? And it was never that simple, really, but it certainly isn't that simple now. The need to continue engaging the successes and the foibles of modernity is essential to evangelization, not just in the now secularizing West, but also in East Asia, Africa, all these places, I think. Right? So that's one thing to say. But on the other hand, like Lo Guang as well, I mean, to this point, he would say that there remains this kind of fundamental disposition in China that you you can't really eclipse the tradition in some respects, right? And the Communist Party of China tried very, very hard in the Cultural Revolution, and then it actually is kind of interesting. If you look at 1960s and the 70s in the Cultural Revolution, there was an attempt to stomp out the four olds, which Confucianism, Chinese philosophical tradition, was considered part of this. And then 40 years later, the CCP-led China was supporting Confucius institutes all throughout the world. Right? They actually realized that it was necessary to embrace the classical principles in some degree, right? That they couldn't eradicate them completely, and I think that's a very good indicator as well, that there is a way in which the Chinese culture has stubbornly resisted the utter modernization or utter we say conversion to materialism that we see, right? It's both traditionalistic and modern in some respects. So you need both angles toward evangelization, I think. Um, if I could sum it up in one little thing, it would be that you have to deal with the problems of modernity, but to have a compelling account of the faith, I think you'd still need to be able to articulate it in light of the classical Chinese philosophical traditions and engage those to have it be really compelling, right?
The first four books that you've selected are writings by or on eminent figures of the Catholic Church in China. To some extent, they trace the trajectory of the Church in China, at least up to the 50s or 60s. Is there available in English a good history of the Church in China?
Well, I guess available is a key word. So Ignatius Press did have a translation of Father Jean-Pierre Charbonnier. He wrote a book called Christians in China. It was originally in French, and now it's in English. But I think their copies are somewhat limited. But he has it's my favorite single volume history of the church in China. You also have other shorter volumes like Daniel Bayes, who's a Protestant historian, right? He has a very accessible book on the history of Christianity in China. So those are the two that come to mind as nice surveys. There are some older ones that are worth looking into, but those are the two main ones that stick out.
Currently, the freedoms of the Catholic Church in China, not just Catholics, but members of other religions, are being suppressed in various ways by the state. Is there any definite position within early Chinese thought on the limits of legitimate state power on religious liberty?
It's actually ironic. I've been trying to drafting articles to think about this question in Chinese Catholicism. Excuse me, because I do think religious liberty is a fascinating question. Well, I'll say this: the fascinating thing is when you look at how Christianity or Catholicism, more properly, finds its footing in China, very early on it faces a crisis where the Bureau of Rights, as it's called, the leader of that bureau decides to take on the Catholic tradition and have it extirpated, right? And it's nearly successful, right? And some of the rationale for this was that Catholicism is uh, subversive of the kind of good morals of the Christian tradition, or sorry, the Chinese tradition, and that it's part of subversive political groups. And so there was a very famous Taoist-leaning group called the White Lotus Society that had been had led to political challenges of the Ming rulers, in the Ming Dynasty, the rulers of the Ming Dynasty, and the Catholics were painted with this brush, right? So, on the one hand, so you look at the fast and the way that Catholics responded to this argument, I think, is key to this, right? There's no real challenge to the notion that the state has a right or obligation to suppress dangerous or seditious elements, right? Like there's no, at least early on, no robust concept of religious liberty as you might expect, right? So they engage much like early Christian apologists did in arguing about whether Christianity is not one of these things. It's not a seditious. It's not contrary to sound morals, and in fact, people like Matteo Ricci begin to assert and show how the Catholic tradition robustly aligns with a lot of the kind of fundamental moral convictions of Chinese Confucianism, for example. So I think in that way, there's a kind of necessary conceit, right, about the fact that there's no term of religion in this case, early in this place in China, that the religious kind of things do touch on the public good and the common good, and they do fall under the state in some way. But so on the one hand, there's the question of how the state properly exercises its authority. That becomes a later question in Chinese Catholicism, and the nature of Catholicism, particularly as a helpful rather than harmful element in this. So at least that's the early on, and then later on, you do have, of course, expansion of that conversation on religious liberty and how the state should proceed. We can get into that if you like, but it's a whole other difficult conversation. But yeah, it's a messy history, put that way.
The first book is Matteo Ricci's The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven. In it, the important Jesuit missionary engages Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism in a dialogue on the existence and nature of God, creation, human nature, and virtue. This dialogue is largely philosophical in character and meant to make his interlocutors more disposed to listen to the good news. I've chosen this work as an early example and eminent model of Chinese Catholicism.
Well, I suppose in some ways. I mean, so certainly, one thing to say about this is the True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, or Tianzhu Shiyi, is one of the only early texts of Chinese Catholic life that is actually translated and readable for an English audience, right, or European audience, right? There's just not a lot that's been made available. So that's one thing. Like this is just a short stack of things to draw from. And it certainly held tremendous importance for later Chinese Catholic history. Matteo Ricci's work is not perfect, right? But it sets the table in a lot of important ways. Is it Chinese Catholic? Well, yes and no, right? I mean, because on the one hand, the way the work is structured, right, is it's taking a broadly Thomistic, scholastic account of natural theology or natural theology. That is the argument for God's existence, things like this. And essentially, you could say it's kind of translating those Aristotelian scholastic principles into terms that Chinese people could understand, right? And almost like the arguments themselves, translating them. So in that way, it remains a very Aristotelian, Thomistic kind of work, right? It does have, though, it's one of the first kind of major text to deeply engage, at least at moments, the Chinese tradition. Now, granted, I would say that Father Ricci didn't get these traditions exactly right sometimes, right? And this makes perfect sense. He's one of the first to actually read the texts of Chinese or philosophy from the West, to try to study them well. And it takes several hundred years of that kind of study to get, a real competency in the Western interpreters, right? So you can quibble with his reading of the Neo-Confucians, for example, or I would say his interpretation of Mengzi in the penultimate chapter of the book. But he's the first one to try to do it well, right? And I think there is a lot of exemplary things in Father Ricci, right? Namely, one thing, he certainly sees that the Chinese traditions are not simply, pagan foolishness that must be dispensed with, but they're traditions that are to be wrestled with. And even when he disagrees with them, like when Taoism and Buddhism, he tries to, seems like best he can, engage what they are and not engage in fallacious kind of dismissals. So in that way, as a kind of robust engagement and articulating how the teaching of the Catholic faith that lifts up and perfects all that is good in the Chinese traditions. I think in that sense, yes, Father Ricci is certainly an exemplar that is imitated in later Chinese Catholic theology and practice.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.